It's a pleasure to be here. You all might be wondering how I got here. A few months ago, I'm with Emerging Civil War, and a few months ago, I was listening to a podcast, and Mike Somerville and Greg Bain were being interviewed, and I'm listening, and I'm thinking, there's a Civil War roundtable in the UK, and I was shocked. But not as shocked as my wife, Martha, who's here, because I am not a world traveler. I do not like to travel. A couple of years ago, my wife twisted my arm, and we did go to Ireland, Scotland, in connection with my church. And I said, never, ever. It was a nice trip, but I said, never, ever again. That's the deal. One overseas trip. I'm a homebody. So my wife was shocked when at dinner, a couple nights after the interview on the podcast, I said, would you like to go to London? And the response was she ignored me because she thought I was making a bad joke. And I said, no, I'll go to London. And she said, why? I said, there's a Civil War roundtable, and I think I'll get to speak. So now my wife is searching for Civil War roundtables in France, et cetera. But today, we're going to talk about Fitz John Porter. I am a former lawyer, practiced for 36 years, retired. I call myself a recovering lawyer. And years ago, I ran into, in an old bookstore, the transcript from the official records of the Fitz John Porter court-martial, and I thought this would be a wonderful thing to review as a lawyer, as if I were representing Fitz John. Are there any points for appeal? And I entered the project with no bias either way. And the result, among other things, is this lecture. Now, most people, including Civil War buffs, don't know Fitz John Porter. They may have heard the name, but he is pretty much a mystery, and that's because he fell out of the war relatively early on due to the court-martial, which is interesting because Porter played a key role in the early months and even years of the American Civil War. In fact, he has been referred to, as you see, as the Forrest Gump of 1861. I give credits, title courtesy of Kevin Pollak, who I believe is your next speaker in September. If you remember the movie and if you remember Forrest Gump, he seemed to be everywhere, including at historically significant events. And so too with Porter. There's a brief bio of Porter. And if you look at what is highlighted in blue, you see that Porter was personally involved in some very key moments and made some very key decisions for the Union cause that had a significant impact on the war. And I can go into them in the question and answer if anyone has questions. But for our present purposes, what we should know is by the summer of 1862, the second summer of the war, Porter has emerged as one of the most important, certainly the most experienced U.S. combat leaders. As the commander of the 5th Corps of the Army of the Potomac, he played a key role in fending off Robert E. Lee's efforts to destroy the Army of the Potomac in the so-called 7 Days campaign, where Lee is attacking George McClellan, Porter's commander, around the gates of Richmond, driving him back. Porter actually defeated Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia on the first of Lee's offensives during that campaign at Mechanicsville, also known as Beaver Dam Creek. The next day, he held out all day, masterful defensive stand at Gaines Mill. It took the largest charge ever engaged in by the Army of Northern Virginia. Some historians say 35,000 rebels participated in the charge. May take its charge without skirmishing. That's what it took to drive Porter from the field. But the apex of Porter's military career came on the last of the 7 days, July 1, 1862, at Malvern Hill. There, Porter effectively led the Army of the Potomac while McClellan, his superior, set out the battle safely on a gunboat in the James River, for which he was later ridiculed. This is an 1864 campaign poster referring to McClellan as the gunboat captain, impinging his courage because he set out the battle on a gunboat. Meanwhile, Porter is leading the troops that's inflicting a stinging defeat on Lee's army. Malvern Hill is the battle of which Confederate General D.H. Hill later was to write, "It was not war, it was murder." Porter's performance and his gallant personal conduct wanted him unstinted praise from McClellan. In one telegram to Washington urging Porter's promotion, McClellan ended with "Would that the country have more general officers like him." Porter's star was on the rise. Who knows where he might have ended up in the pantheon of United States military leaders if his star had continued on that trajectory. Well, spoiler alert, it didn't. 4 months to the day from Porter's great victory at Malvern Hill, he found himself in the dock of a court-martial. His career and indeed his life at risk. Porter was accused of violation of orders and misconduct in the face of the enemy for his actions during the campaign and battle of Second Manassas. Porter was convicted after a lengthy trial. He was sentenced to be cashiered from the Army, plus the sentence said that he was to be precluded from holding any office of trust or profit under the United States, meaning that he was going from being one of the most important Union generals to a man who couldn't get a job at the local post office. That's my local post office. Porter's last hope for a reprieve was crushed by Abraham Lincoln, who signed an order endorsing the verdict and the sentence. For the next 16 years, Porter fought to clear his name, begging for a new hearing. Finally, in 1879, a 3-officer commission, known as the Schofield Commission or the Schofield Board, took a fresh look at his case, heard new evidence, and issued a report of it. Took another 7 years due to politics, but finally, Porter was reinstated to the U.S. Army with the rank of colonel, no back pay, and shortly thereafter, he officially retired. Now, for that 23-year period, and really for the rest of his life, Porter had to endure attacks on his reputation. He was frequently called a traitor. For example, in the 1880s, John Pope, who had been Porter's commanding officer at Second Manassas, penned an article for, probably familiar with Century Magazine's famous Battles and Leaders series. And in that article, Pope went after Porter again, referred to him as a Benedict Arnold. In our neck of the pond, that's not a compliment. And Pope supported his attack, latest attack on Porter, by pointing out that he had been convicted by court-martial in 62, 63. Porter's supporters, and he did have, said, well, wait a minute, he's been exonerated by the Schofield Commission. The problem was that the Schofield Commission not only had the benefit of hindsight, they were looking at these events 16 years later, but they had the benefit of testimony and evidence from ex-Confederates. James Longstreet, for example, General James Longstreet of the Confederates, he testified before the Schofield Board. He explained when he had arrived on the battlefield, how many troops he had with him, where they were positioned during the battle in relation to Porter, testimony that went a long way toward showing that Porter's failure to attack, despite orders, had been reasonable. But that doesn't mean that the members of the court-martial were wrong in the decision they ultimately reached in 1863. They couldn't wait for the Confederates to testify. No, they proceeded to judge Porter based on the evidence before them. Or did they? Porter claimed that he had been the victim of a political vendetta. Porter was a friend and protege of George McClellan, And as many of you know, in the summer of 1862, George McClellan was in very bad odor with the so-called radical Republican faction of the Republican Party. That was the faction that wanted to convert the Union war aim from a war to restore the Union into a crusade to free the slaves. They also wanted the Lincoln administration to adopt a so-called hard war policy, meaning don't just attack the rebel armies, punish the disloyal civilians. Both McClellan and Porter were publicly opposed to both policies. John Pope, however, supported the radical Republicans, and he was their new hope in the summer of 62. So let's turn to Pope. Wrong Pope. John Pope. There's a short bio of Pope. And I know you just had a conference on the battles in Second Manassas, so we won't dwell on Pope. That's a contemporary cartoon. In a nutshell, it's the contemporary view of Pope endorsing a hard war policy. He is not going to fight the war with, as Lincoln said, elder stalks, squirrels charged with rosewood. He was a proponent of hard war. Now, I said that Porter commanded a corps under George McClellan. So how did he run afoul of John Pope? Well, it happened this way. June of 1862, John Pope, who has had some success in the Western theater, is brought east and by Lincoln, and he's placed in command of a newly created army, the Army of Virginia. Pope's mission is to drive into central Virginia and threaten and ideally capture Gordonsville, Virginia, which was a vital railway for Lee, who's at Richmond, fighting off McClellan, and the resource-rich Shenandoah Valley. But before Pope could get moving, Lee launches his 7 days campaign, the result of which is he knocks McClellan and the Army of Potomac back from the gates of Richmond. For the month of July, after Malvern Hill, and into August, there was a stalemate in the Eastern Theater. Pope couldn't move. He felt he didn't have enough men to accomplish his mission, and the strategic situation had completely changed. Lee is warily watching Pope's army, but he can't move from Richmond to deal with it, while McClellan's army, while defeated, is still a powerful force and in the neighborhood of Richmond. McClellan, for his part, refuses to resume his offensive unless he's heavily reinforced, which is not going to happen. So in August, the Lincoln administration breaks the stalemate. They order McClellan to abandon his campaign, move his army north back to Washington, and start sending his troops to reinforce John Pope. McClellan does not like these orders because he, probably rightly, sees John Pope as a threat to his own command. But the order is reiterated, and elements of the Army of the Potomac start to move north, and as fate would have it, the first unit to reinforce John Pope was Fitz John Porter's group. Lee quickly figures out what's going on, and he moves north to confront Pope. Lee's goal is simple: destroy Pope's army before the Army of the Potomac can fully reinforce it. Now, to get at Pope, who is hunkered down behind the Rappahannock River, Lee devises a bold plan. He sends Stonewall Jackson on a very long flank, 56 miles, next Chancellorsville looked like child's play, to get into Pope's rear. Jackson succeeds in spectacular fashion. On August 26, 27, Jackson falls on Pope's umbilical cord to Washington, the Orange and Alexander Railroad, and cuts it, burns a key bridge. Then he moves to Manassas Junction, where Pope has his supply base, and destroys it. So Pope's in trouble. He has lost his communications with Washington. He has lost his accumulated supplies, and he's got Jackson with about 25,000 men rampaging in his rear. But Pope sees an opportunity in this crisis. Jackson has just marched 56 miles. He is isolated from the rest of Lee's army, the wing under James Longstreet. Pope concludes that if he moves fast enough, he should be able to attack and overwhelm and win a wonderful victory against the legendary Stonewall Jackson before Longstreet. And for the last several days of August, that's what he tries to do. On August 29, he attacks Jackson. On August 30, he attacks Jackson again. But in the afternoon of August 30, Longstreet, who has arrived on the field, when he arrived becomes a matter of controversy at the trial, the court martial. But on the afternoon of August 30, he's certainly there because he launches a devastating flank attack on Porter's Army of Virginia and drives it from the field in a rout. As a consequence, Pope is relieved of his command, and his troops, ironically, are turned over to McClellan. Pope is humiliated. Pope is angry. And Pope goes looking for a scapegoat to explain his humiliating defeat. And scapegoat number one is Fitz John Porter and the trial. So we're going to take a look at some key elements. Was it fair, or was it a modern day Star Chamber? Now, before we get into what the court did to Porter, let's take a look at the members. That's a contemporary sketch of the court. The members of the court, there were 9 of them, 2 major generals, 7 brigadier generals. They each had one thing in common. Each was handpicked for the job by Lincoln's Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. And that should raise a red flag for anybody who knows that at this point, Stanton has thrown in his political lot with the radicals, who, as I said, hate McClellan. And Stanton independently hates McClellan. And he hates anybody in the so-called McClellan clique of the Army of the Potomac. Stanton packs the court with fellow radicals, with his friends or associates, and with those who perhaps had an incentive to find Porter guilty. David Hunter, Major General David Hunter, would preside. He was a well-known radical. He was so radical that he issued an emancipation proclamation and started arming the slaves for his department in the South. I think it was April of 1862, months before. Right. He had to revoke them. Benjamin Prentice, hero of the Hornets' Nest at Shiloh, was another radical. Ethan Allen Hitchcock was Stanton's personal military advisor and in Stanton's pocket, would do whatever Stanton wanted. Napoleon Bonaparte Buford, these great names. The half-brother of John Buford of Gettysburg fame. Napoleon Buford was personally lobbied by Stanton. Stanton had Buford and Hitchcock over to his house for a Thanksgiving dinner right before the trial started, and by all accounts made his wishes well known. Napoleon Buford also told his half-brother that Lincoln's Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon Chase, another prominent radical, also had talked to him about the right thing to do. Silas Casey was on the court. Casey had a grudge against Porter because Porter had blocked Casey from taking up an important command on the peninsula during the 7 days campaign. Porter thought Casey was incompetent. Future U.S. President James Garfield was on the court martial. Garfield was lobbied by General Irvin McDowell. Now, probably remember McDowell. He was the loser on the U.S. side at the first battle of Manassas. But General McDowell also led a corps at Second Manassas, and his performance had been harshly criticized by John Pope, and McDowell was facing a court of inquiry that threatened his career. So he had an incentive to shift blame for the loss at Second Manassas. Rufus King and James Ricketts also had led troops at Second Manassas. Pope had also criticized their performance, and they were facing possible courts of inquiry. So again, they had an incentive to shift blame. Keep Rufus King's name in mind, by the way. I'll tell you why later. John Slow was the last member of the court, if my count is accurate. He was a longtime friend of Stanton. John Slow was also a last-minute replacement on the court martial. He replaced a general, or brevet brigadier general by the name of Morris, excuse me, William Morris. Morris had served in the old army with Porter and respected him. Worse, Morris had raised an objection to the court martial. He felt that it had been illegally constituted, and we'll get into that in a moment. But as soon as he raised his objection and proved himself a troublemaker, he was kicked off, and Stanton replaced him with his friend, John Slow. So that's the court. At least from my description, it looks like a hanging court, but we'll see. So the court opens. First substantive session is December 1, ironically 5 months to the day after Porter's great victory at Malvern Hill. The charges are read. Porter is charged with violating a series of orders. First, on August 27th, 2 days before the main battle started, on the evening of August 27, Porter receives an order from Pope to make a night march. The order is very specific. Start your march at 1 in the morning on August 28th, and the order said, it is necessary on all accounts that you be with me by daybreak. It is undisputed that Porter disobeyed that order. He was ordered to march at 1. He decided, I'll delay until 3. He was ordered on all accounts to be with Pope by daybreak. He was several hours late. Next order, called so-called joint order, because it was addressed jointly to Irvin McDowell and Fitz John Porter. I won't quote it, but it arrived about noon of the first day of the battle, August 29. I won't quote it, but suffice to say, it's very confusing. It's arguably self-contradictory. But the important thing to know that in Pope's mind, it was an order for Porter to attack, and to attack Jackson's right flank. Pope's battle plan for the 29th was that he would attack Jackson's center and left flank, and Porter would come in, attack Jackson's right flank, roll it up, and hence a great victory. All afternoon, as Pope is attacking, doing his part, he's waiting to hear sounds of battle on the left. Porter doesn't attack. So later in the day, Pope issues another order, the so-called 430. This one is explicit. Attack. The order says, your line of march brings you in on Jackson's flank. Attack his flank, and if possible, his rear. In response to that express order, Porter doesn't attack. So by the evening, Pope is extremely frustrated, and he issues another order. Upon receipt of this order, march your whole command and join me on the battlefield. Porter doesn't obey that order either, to the extent that through sloppy staff work, 2 of his brigades miss a turn and march completely off the battlefield. So those are the orders he's violated. He's also accused of misconduct in the face of the enemy. The theory there was, even without an order, you're a corps commander. You should have attacked because you knew that your commanding general was engaged in battle. You could hear it, and that he needed help. Now, a lawyer will tell you, in a quasi-criminal or criminal trial, you're looking for a motive. Why would Porter disobey all these orders? Why wouldn't he come to his commanding general's help? Well, the prosecutor had a theory. Prosecutor, this man, Holt, another crony of Stanton. They had served briefly at the end of the Buchanan administration in the cabinet. The prosecutor had a theory. Prosecutor Hull, Judge Advocate General Hull, had in his possession a series of telegrams that Porter had sent prior to the battle. And in those telegrams, Porter made some very disparaging comments about Pope, basically called him an idiot who doesn't know what he's doing. Jackson's running rings around this. Worse, Porter made it very clear that he wanted to get away from Pope's command. He wanted to get back under the command of his buddy, McClellan. And in one particular telegram, Porter wrote, "My birthday is coming." He said, "My birthday is coming. My star always rises on my birthday. I hope that Max, McClellan's star, also is on the rise." Very interesting language. Holt's theory was that the reason that Porter disobeyed orders, didn't attack, didn't support Pope in battle, is because Porter wanted Pope to lose the battle. That way, in the ensuing crisis, Lincoln would have no choice but to turn back and rely on Porter's friend McClellan. That's a very serious charge because that is treason. And that's why Porter's life, in fact, was at risk during this proceeding. December 3, court convenes again, and Porter's asked, "How do you plead?" In response, his able counsel filed a motion, moved to dissolve the court on the grounds that it has been illegally constituted. Remember, Morris had that objection. The basis of the motion was that the Articles of War, which governed court-martial, mandated that any time the commander of an army brought charges, the court-martial had to be convened by order of the President of the United States. This court had been convened by order of General-in-Chief Henry Halleck. That's not good enough. Now, lest you think this is some cheap lawyer's trick, and I know all about cheap lawyer's trick, not that I ever engaged in it, or a ploy for delay, there was a strategy for Porter's counsel. A trial lawyer, a barrister, will tell you that if you can show that a witness has a bias, has an interest in the outcome of a case, it's easier to undermine his credibility. Porter's counsel wanted to show that John Pope was behind these charges, and then they would argue he doesn't believe it, he's just looking for a scapegoat. So we have this motion, and this is the first time as a lawyer, I'm seeing what could be called an anomaly, how the court acted. So the motion prompted the following colloquy between Porter's counsel and Holt. A little bit of literary license, but it basically went like this. Porter's counsel: "We wish to know if General Pope is bringing these charges." Judge Advocate Holt: "The order constituting this court doesn't say it's bringing the charges." Porter's counsel: "Yes, we know, but isn't General Pope behind the charges?" Holt: "No, absolutely not. General Benjamin Roberts signed the charges." Porter's counsel: "Yes, we know that, but Roberts is on Pope's staff. Isn't Pope using Roberts as his agent to bring the charges?" Holt: "Certainly not. In fact, General Pope has never brought any charges against General Porter." Porter's counsel: "Really? That's interesting. Here's an order from General Halleck of just 2 weeks ago, referring to a court of inquiry being formed against General Porter, and the purpose of the court of inquiry, according to General Halleck, is to examine charges against General Porter brought by General Pope." Holt: No, he didn't say. He didn't say Holt actually said, "Pay no attention to that. That court of inquiry never did anything. It was dissolved," which is true. It was dissolved and it was turned into the court-martial with the identical members, excepting Morris being replaced by Slough, which doesn't really address the question. Now, the anomaly is nobody on the court speaks up and says words to the effect, "Pope, you're obviously bobbing and weaving here. Tell us true. On your word, is Pope behind these charges, directly or indirectly?" They never speak up. And of course, Pope was behind. He had, as it turned out, he had bribed his Inspector General Roberts, who's saying, "I'll get your promotion if you put your names to charges so I can keep my skirts clean." The court adjourns to consider the issue in private. Pope joins them in the deliberations, which he would do every time, which I don't think at the time was considered unethical. He was their legal advisor. But the fact is, with one exception, every time the court adjourns to consider some issue, Holt joins them, and every time except one, they come out and they rule against Ford, always. So here too, they come out and they rule motion denied. So Pope gets to testify as a simple objective truth teller, rather than someone looking for a scapegoat. But to give you some context about the orders Porter is getting during the battle that he's not obeying, a problem was that during the battle, as he's issuing these orders, Pope has a completely misunderstood. He completely misunderstands the circumstances of the battlefield. This is what Pope thinks the battlefield looks like. He thinks Jackson's line goes like that. He thinks Porter is here, actually on Jackson's flank. And there's nothing in the world to prevent Porter from swinging around and crushing it. Now, this is the reality. Jackson's flank is pulled back there. That, in fact, is the situation that was facing Porter. But Pope is, and Holt are arguing to the court that this is the reality and that Porter had no excuse in not following orders. So Pope takes the witness stand. He's the first witness. His direct testimony is pretty uneventful. He testifies, "I issued these orders. No reason he shouldn't have obeyed them. He disobeyed them." But Pope was permitted to go beyond simple, "This is what I did, this is what I heard, this is what happened," and was allowed to give his opinion on matters. For example, he opined that if only General Porter had obeyed my orders, we would have won a great victory. He also opined that it was because General Porter didn't obey my orders that we lost. And in my opinion, that placed the safety of the capital at risk, and by extension, the loss of the war. So Pope is doing a very good job of smearing Porter as the scapegoat. And by the way, there are newspaper reporters in the courtroom taking all this down. So his direct testimony ends, and Porter's counsel gets a crack at Pope. And here again, we'll see some anomalies from the members of the court martial. Porter's counsel, one of the first questions was asking Pope to confirm that shortly after the night march incident, Porter had come to Pope and explained why he had done what he did, why he delayed, why he was late, and that Pope had said, "Okay, that's a satisfactory explanation. I have no problem with that." Now, in response to that, Pope says, "I don't recall any such meeting or conversation." Now, a trial lawyer will tell you that when a witness says, "I don't recall," that's not a denial. That's simply, "I don't recall whether or not something has happened." Some witnesses use the "I don't recall, I don't remember" dodge when they don't want to come out right and lie. Although, as I've told witnesses, if you say you don't recall something when you do, that's a lie. But I think psychologically, some people prefer to lie by saying, "I don't recall." Remember that principle. Now here, pressed for a straight answer, Pope grudgingly concedes, "Yes, there might have been such a meeting. I might have told him I was satisfied with his conduct," but then quickly adds, "But in my own mind, I wasn't satisfied." raising the question of why you're lying to Porter, but okay. Then Porter's counsel asked broader questions. And they asked Pope to confirm that shortly after the battle, in another meeting with Porter, Pope had told Porter that he was completely satisfied with all his conduct during the recent battle, including how the manner in which he had carried out his orders. To that, Pope says, oh, no, that never happened. Porter's counsel then plays an ace. And he says, well, don't you remember that your own chief of staff, George Ruggles, once reminded you that you had that meeting and said that to Porter? Now Pope's got a problem. Now he realizes his own chief of staff has been talking to Porter's counsel. What's he going to do? Call his own chief of staff a liar? He starts to equivocate, pussyfoot around. He says, I have no memory. I don't remember that conversation. Then he says, I am very certain that, I'm sorry, Ruggles. I am very certain that Ruggles never said such a thing to me, but I'm not willing to swear to it. I have no knowledge of it. Pope is all over the lot. His credibility is starting to crumble, and he's opening a huge hole in the government's case. Because if the commanding general of the Army of Virginia had told Porter that he had no problem with how he carried out his orders, why is the government prosecuting? Porter. Pope then digs his hole deeper. He volunteers, and we always tell witnesses, don't volunteer. But Pope volunteers that he did tell Porter that as matters then stood, I did not intend to bring his conduct to the attention of the authorities in Washington. That was a mistake. Porter's counsel pounces and asks, General Pope, if, as you have testified, you believe that the accused violated your orders and that caused you to lose the battle, and that placed the safety of the Capitol at risk, why is it then that you told him that you would not bring his conduct to the attention of Washington? Pope, you read the transcript, Pope clearly doesn't have an answer to that very good question. He must have frozen. And then in what must have been an act of desperation, Pope, the witness, says, the question is improper, I refuse to answer. Well, the question was certainly proper. In fact, Holt knew it was proper. He hadn't even objected. Moreover, witnesses don't get to decide when a question is proper. That's the province of the court. Somebody on the court, any of the 9 members, should have spoken up and said, General Pope, answer the question. Instead, they decide they need to adjourn to consider the issue. What's there to consider? There's no objection. Instead, or nevertheless, they go back and they come out, Holt joins them again, and they come out and they say, the question is improper. We are directing the witness not to answer. So they're ordering Pope not to answer, giving him full cover. Porter's counsel promptly files a formal written protest. And as I said, newspaper reporters are in here taking all this down. Things are not going well for the government. They're not looking good right now. And it's this point, the presiding judge, Hunter, says, this would be a good time to adjourn for the day. So the adjournment accomplishes 2 things. One, it gets Pope off the hot seat where he's not doing well. And second, it gives him overnight to think of a way out of his problem, which he does with the help of Holt, who met with him overnight, and they came up with an idea to get out of it. So the next day, when Pope resumes his witness, resumes the witness stand, suddenly Pope says, I would be happy to answer the question that was posed to me yesterday. This puts the court in kind of a bind because they've already ruled it's not a proper question and ordered him not to answer. So they adjourn again. Holt joins them, and they come out and they essentially say, we'd love to hear you answer, General Pope. And then he goes into a long, clearly well-rehearsed speech. And one of the things he says is, now I remember what we talking about, Porter and I. Yes, there was such a meeting. I remember what we were talking about. I had learned that he had written some letters and telegrams disparaging me. And when I heard Porter's explanation on that point, I told him I was satisfied with his explanation. That's what we were talking about. And I, as far as reporting into Washington, all I did was write a report of the battle. I've never charged him with anything, which was a lie. He goes on, and whether you think it's a good answer or not, it's fuzz. It got him off the hot seat. Now, as an aside, it was in fact true that they had a meeting to discuss a letter that Porter had written before the campaign started, and that's the quote from the letter. And that letter and that quote, referring to Pope as an ass, made its way up to Abraham Lincoln. And Lincoln showed it to Pope before the battle. Now, that's not a way to curry favor with your future commanding general. So, cross-examination resumes after Pope's speech. And Porter's counsel gets some good stuff out of Pope, including an admission that at the time he sent the 4:30 order for Porter to attack Pope's flank, he really didn't know where that flank was, and he didn't really know where Porter was. So Porter's counsel tries again to go in for a key question, and he says, would you have excused his noncompliance with that order if Jackson's flank weren't where you thought it was? Porter would have to march to meet it, and if Longstreet were on the field blocking it. In other words, the truth. A perfectly legitimate question, and the only truthful answer to that question would be, oh, sure, I would have excused its disobedience then. But before Pope can be required to answer, somebody on the court finally speaks up and says, that question calls for mere opinion. It's improper. Mere opinion. No, it doesn't. Second, Holt hadn't objected. And third, the court had been happy to hear Pope's opinion as long as it was adverse to Porter. But the court adjourns again, comes out and says, the witness will not answer the question. It calls for mere opinion. And by the way, we want to make it clear that we are now not allowing opinion testimony in this proceeding. Okay, so Pope slithers off the stand, having been helped with very timely intercessions by the court. Holt then calls First Lieutenant Drake McKay, who carried the night march order. Then he calls General Benjamin Roberts, Pope's Inspector General, and Porter's nominal accuser. And Holt promptly asked Roberts this question: what in your judgment would have happened if Porter had obeyed his orders? Objection. Calls for an opinion. And Porter's counsel no doubt was confident the objection would be sustained because the court had just said minutes before, no opinions. Well, the rules apparently had changed. The court said, oh, we'll allow it. And Roberts dutifully responds, oh, we would have backed Jackson. The court's refusal to pin Holt down on who was bringing the charges, its inconsistent application of this opinion testimony, and especially its repeated stepping in to help Pope when he got in trouble, weren't the only anomalies during this legal proceeding. Witnesses, if they were adverse to Porter, were permitted to speculate what was going on in Porter's mind. Lieutenant Drake McKay, who I mentioned carried the night march order, was allowed to testify. I handed General Porter the order. He looked at it. And, I think right then and there, General Porter decided, I'm gonna violate this order. He didn't have any real evidence for that. Porter never said in his presence that he was going to modify the order, but he was allowed to say, yeah, I think he made up his mind right there. This character, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas C.H. Smith, he was on Pope's staff, and he gave a veritable psychological profile of who he had never met before the battle. and whose entire interaction with Porter consisted of maybe a 15-minute conversation. Nevertheless, Smith testified that Porter's mannerism, his body language, perhaps, Porter's mannerism was sneering and indifferent when it came to Pope and his orders. On cross, Porter's counsel pointed out, you've never met the guy before. Maybe that's just the way he acts. And Smith said, oh, no, I know these things. And he was only sneering and indifferent when it came to Pope and his orders. He was allowed to testify that to him, Smith, Porter looked like a man with a crime on his mind. And he was allowed to repeat a derogatory defamatory comment. He said that when he got back to camp, Pope's camp, he told General Pope that I am so certain that Fitz John Porter is a traitor, I would shoot him this night as far as any crime against heaven were concerned, if the law of man would allow it. Smith also testified that when he got back to camp, the first thing he did was to pitch his tent to make himself comfortable. Then he went off to get himself a meal. And only when those essentials were taken care of did he wander over to General Pope to say, oh, by the way, your left-wing commander is a traitor who should be shot at. Anything else. That's the kind of nonsense that was allowed in the testimony. And in fact, Smith and other testimony like this would be heavily relied upon by Pope in a post-trial report summarizing the proceedings. General Irvin McDowell testified, and he gave testimony harmful to Porter, which hurt Porter. And I don't mean just legally. Porter thought that McDowell was his friend. But as I indicated, McDowell was currently facing his own court of inquiry, and his career was on the line, and he had every incentive to throw Porter under the bus. Worse, when he was cross-examined, he developed what I would call selective amnesia. Every time he was asked a question by Porter's counsel whose truthful answer would help Porter's defense, McDowell would say, I don't remember, I can't recall, I could not say, I can't be sure. It was very selective, however. Porter's counsel finally sat down, probably thinking, well, at least I've shown his amnesia is selective, I've undercut his credibility. Apparently somebody else thought so too, because the next day, General McDowell was recalled to the witness stand. Not by Porter's counsel, not even by Holt, the prosecutor, but by the court. And the court, a member of the court started lobbing softball questions to McDowell, apparently to try to enhance his credibility and to fill up some holes that had developed in the prosecutor's case, and did very leading questions. Wouldn't you agree that General Porter had ample time to do this or that? McDowell would say, oh, yes. Porter later would write that at this point, a member of the court, he doesn't name it, but it's probably Garfield, a member of the court assumed the attitude of the prosecutor. Nevertheless, despite these handicaps, I think Porter's counsel was doing a credible job. And apparently the government thought so too. Because in the middle of the trial, Hunter, the presiding judge, starts mumbling, complaining. It's all on the record. This proceeding is taking too long. This is being dragged out, and I know why. It's this extended cross-examination that's being engaged in by counsel for the accused. Heavens to Betsy, Porter's counsel is doing too good a job. So Hunter announces that the court is desirous of returning to the usual and customary practice of having the accused himself question witnesses. Now, Porter's no lawyer. This would cripple his defense, and they know it. Porter protests. He says, I can't do that. And you promised me that I could use trained counsel for my defense. Porter was unmoved. Unmoved, that is, until Porter cleverly pointed out, fine, you want to go back to the usual and customary practice, then I insist on my right after every witness's testimony is over, I get sufficient time to go back and write out my questions longhand for someone else then to read to the witness. And that's going to take a lot longer than if you let my trained counsel commence cross-examination upon the ending of the direct testimony. Caught in the illogic of its own position, the court backed in. That's the only time after they adjourned that they ruled in favor of Porter. And personally, I think somebody said, yeah, this is a bridge of unfairness too far. So the prosecution's case ended with the introduction of the damning telegrams. And here too, there was unfairness. Porter's counsel objected that Holt was cherry picking from among the many telegrams that Porter had sent in the days leading up to the campaign. He's only introducing some of them. And Porter's counsel said, we have asked Holt for copies of all the telegrams because some of them contain not only context, but actual exculpatory evidence. And Holt has refused to provide them. Now, faced with this clear prosecutorial misconduct, the court did nothing. It didn't even respond. I'm reading the transcript and I'm seeing Porter's counsel's complaint, and there's nothing. They just ignore him. And then when Porter's counsel tries to introduce the couple of telegrams for which they do have copies, the court said, oh, no, they're irrelevant. They did allow Porter to introduce one telegram. In fact, it was a copy of a telegram that Holt had already introduced, except Porter's copy showed that Holt had altered his copy to make Porter look good. Now, faced with this even clearer prosecutorial misconduct, the court did nothing. Didn't criticize him, didn't even ask a question. How did that happen? Now, I don't have time to go into Porter's defense. Suffice it to say, it was vigorous, many witnesses, I think 36 witnesses, including McClellan. But I do want to touch upon one key defense witness, Lieutenant Colonel Frederick Locke, a member of Porter's staff. Locke testified that he was sent during the battle on August 29 with a message to General Rufus King. And that after he delivered his message to General Rufus King, Irvin McDowell, who happened to be with King, gave Locke a message to take back to General Porter. And Locke said, McDowell's message was this: give my compliments to General Porter, tell him that he should stay where he is, but if necessary for him to fall back, he can do so on my left. Locke gave that message to Porter. Now, this is key bombshell testimony because General McDowell outranks General Porter. So, though phrased in polite language, this message is an order. Stay where you are. In other words, don't attack. So Porter has evidence of an order from a superior officer that exonerates him from the most serious charge against him, that is failing to attack during the afternoon of August 29. He could deal with the 4:30 order otherwise. So from the government's perspective, clearly Locke has to be destroyed, his credibility. Holt cross-examines Locke, and he gets nowhere. It's lovely. Locke's testimony is clear, it's direct, he gives details, it clearly has the ring of truth. So Holt has to recall our amnesia-plagued McDowell. And he recalls McDowell to the witness stand, and you know what he needs from McDowell. He needs McDowell to stand up and say, Locke is a lying, dog-faced pony soldier, whatever it is our former president said. He needs McDowell to say Locke is lying. That's all he needs. But here, McDowell's amnesia-tinged performance actually helps Porter a little bit. Now, McDowell does say, I've thought about it, and I don't remember having such a conversation with Locke. You know, that's really not quite good enough in the face of Locke's unequivocal testimony. So who gets involved? The court. The court starts peppering McDowell with questions, and it's clear they want him to just say he's lying. And the closest they get is the last question that they asked McDowell, and I find this amusing because I can just imagine McDowell's tone when he gives his answer. The question is, last question, are you confident whether or not you had such a conversation with Lieutenant Colonel Locke? And I'll give the imagined tone. McDowell answers, I don't think so. It's just really not compelling. He's saying the words, but it's clearly not compelling. But Holt had another string to his bow. Now, the key conversation obviously is between McDowell and Locke. But Locke had mentioned that General Rufus King was present during this conversation. Now, who can tell me at this point in the trial, where is Rufus King? Where physically is General Rufus King? He's on the bench. He's a judge. He's one of the judges. So what does Holt do? Holt brings King off the bench and turns him into a fact witness. And King promptly says, Locke, I've never seen him before in my life. And McDowell never said such a thing. So now Porter's got a problem. What are you going to do? Call a member of the court a liar? They try to, essentially a flank attack. They asked King on cross to confirm what everybody already knew, that on the day of this alleged conversation, August 29, and for some days prior, King had been very ill. King suffered from epilepsy. And in the days leading up to August 29, King had suffered multiple epileptic seizures. One day during this period, he spent the whole day riding in an ambulance being tended by his division surgeon. The next day, his division had been attacked by a portion of Jackson's force. Battle's not going well for King's men. An officer goes looking for King for orders. Can't find him. A witness later said King had gotten off his horse and was lying flat on his back, stretched out. At first, they thought he had been shot. He wasn't shot. Then they said, oh my God, he's drunk. I don't think he was drunk. He was almost certainly having an epileptic seizure in the middle of the battle. In fact, it was so bad that on August 29, and Porter's counsel drew this out also, what everybody knew. On August 29, King had relinquished control of his division because he was in no shape, health-wise, to lead. And you may or may not know that the effects of epilepsy and an epileptic seizure, you're not aware of what's going on around you. So you see where Porter's counsel is going. They wanted King to concede that due to his health condition, again, he's relinquished command of his division. Due to his health condition, he really couldn't be 100% sure of what was going on around him or what was being said. All they need is from him is give us a break. Say, it's possible I may be mistaken. King doubles down, says, nope, I'm sure. Never saw Locke. McDowell never said that. Now, was King lying? We don't know. We do know he had an incentive to lie because his own battlefield conduct was under scrutiny and he was facing a Boston Portland. There is no way he should have been on that court because of his interest, self-interest. So he gives this testimony and he deep sixes Porter. So then what's he do? He goes right back on the bench and he participates in the remaining proceedings and in the deliberations. So even if somebody on the court during deliberations might have said, well, what about Locke? Locke said this. You would imagine that somebody else on the court would turn to that person, that skeptic, and say, hey, you calling our buddy King a liar? It was very unethical. The last unfairness came with closing arguments of all things. It was well established that as a matter of fundamental fairness, the accused always gets the last word. So naturally, here, the court said to Porter's counsel, you go first. So Holt, the prosecution, gets to hear all of Porter's arguments and how they summarize the case, where they're going. And then Holt gets up and says, well, this has taken so long. In the interest of time, I will waive my closing. So Porter's counsel doesn't get a chance to reply. And then what Holt does is he puts his closing argument in a post-trial report to Lincoln. And in that post-trial report, it's a poisonous document. It's filled with misleading statements, with half-truths, with at least one outright lie. But you'll be happy to know that Holt made a point of telling Lincoln that the court-martial had been scrupulously fair to General Porter. And I want to get this right. He wrote, quote, the court was not only patient and just, but liberal. And in the end, everything was received in evidence which could possibly tend to place the accused in its true light. It is not believed that there remains upon the record a single ruling of the court to which exception could be seriously taken. It would have been comical. This would have been comical, but for the consequences that are about to come down on Porter's head. Lincoln reads the post-trial summary. He's predictably inflamed, and he signs the order that turns Major General Fitz John Porter into what I would say is the last casualty of Second Manassas. Thank you.